Well, good morning and welcome to another of our continuing Wednesday morning live stream panel discussions for entrepreneurs, innovators, and investors. So AI is kind of the hot thing of the year, right? It was just over a year ago that ChatGPT was released, and I believe it became the fastest application to ever accumulate 1 million registered users. And right now it's all about AI. But it also means the regulators are starting to get on this, right? That the regulators and legislative bodies are trying to figure out what kind of regulation needs to be wrapped around this new AI thing. And you may have heard that last week, in the lead up to the primary election in New Hampshire, that voters were getting a call from Joe Biden telling them to stay home, don't vote, save your vote for November. Except it turned out, of course, it wasn't Joe Biden. It was an AI-generated voice to sound like Joe Biden. So it's a pretty hot topic right now. And joining me to talk about this are a couple of awesome attorney friends of mine, starting with Natasha. Morning, Natasha.
Good morning. How are you, Brett?
I'm good. So tell us what we need to know about you.
Great, absolutely. So Natasha Allen, I am a partner at Foley and Lardner in the Silicon Valley area. I wear many hats at the firm. So I'm a transactional attorney, but I'm also the co-chair of the AI subsector at Foley and Lardner. So Foley is, set up in different sectors, one of which is the innovative tech sector. And I lay within that, and I am the co-chair of the AI subsector. So I've been fortunate to kind of be on the forefront, having questions from clients in terms of what's going on, what should they be looking at. Foley has a huge roster of blogs, information, just about the different things that are going on. Because as you mentioned, Brett, things are moving very rapidly.
Yeah, right. All right, welcome. Also joining us this morning is Louis Lowe. Good morning, Louis.
Good morning, everybody. Louis Lowe. I'm a startup lawyer. I help startups get formed, financed, scaled for growth, bought and sold. And you couldn't be in the Silicon Valley and not say AI for every single venture that you're working on these days. So delighted to participate. And thanks to my partner, Natasha, for spearheading today.
So, Louis, I went on to ChatGPT and I asked it to write me a limerick about you, Louis Lowe. And the problem is that the rhymes didn't work because it thought your name was pronounced Lewis. So, Louis, are you in favor of regulation that would require AI engines to know how to properly pronounce your name?
No, I'm not in favor. I'm not in favor. It would take all the fun out of it, Brett. And generally, if you ask me if I'm in favor of regulation, most of the time I say no.
Right.
Which will be a theme of today.
So speaking of which, so back in October, the Biden administration issued an executive order on AI. And it's kind of a funny executive order to read because on one hand, it's promoting all of the amazing things about AI and how it's going to be a driver of growth and opportunity. And on the other hand, it lays out the fact that AI is a grave danger to society and we need to pass legislation to rein it in.
Yeah.
So is there anything from that particular executive order that that entrepreneurs, startup founders, and investors should worry about today, or is that one of those toothless executive orders?
I think it's Natasha knows the details. Natasha?
I would say heed warning, because prior to this executive order, there was kind of more of an airy-fairy outline of what AI should be and how we should regulate it. I think this is giving you a little more meat. Obviously, it is still very broad, and we were actually able to pull from different industries, like how would it apply to a particular industry, because nobody really knows. Really what the administration said was large agencies in the government, figure it out and come back to us. That's essentially what they said. Figure out how to regulate your folks and tell us what to do. So, in that regard, it was, at least there's a little bit of movement, I think, in the right direction. But I do think a lot of these things should be listened to and kind of paid attention to. And on Monday, some people say, was it a political ploy or whatever it was, but the administration also had some more meat in terms of like what they're thinking with their executive order. They highlighted a lot in terms of, safety, making sure that testing is happening. So that's something that I think companies cannot ignore. And a lot of it is going to be tied around the explainability of what is happening. Like that's been a theme that's been going on for quite a long time. The concept in the Biden administration of the red team. So that's a team that just looks at the outputs and sets an alarm if something is odd or off. That's, I think, should definitely be, people should be aware of. Consumer protection, which, I think the funny thing, and I was talking to somebody about this too, is there are still laws in existence, whether you put AI on something or not. So, fraud is fraud, whether you're using
Fraud
AI
is fraud,
to
right?
be fraudulent versus not using AI to be fraudulent. So just thinking that just because you're wrapping AI around it doesn't mean you're free and clear of the laws that already exist.
Right.
But I do think, the government or the federal government is really pushing on the agencies to give them insights into what they should be worrying about and how they should be regulating it. But there are things that are in place, like privacy rules are still in place. Those are things that you really should be paying attention to. You were talking about the states and what happened in New Hampshire. So in terms of the states itself, the focus as of, the beginning of 2024 is really on the elections, right? Deep fakes, like you said, fake voice over, all those are really what the states have kind of put out bills. And obviously, put out a bill, we don't know if it'll actually become legislation, but around deep fakes and when you can have deep fakes and if you should be putting notifications. So that's the focus, I think, as of the beginning of 2024 is really the election.
Right. Yeah, and I think, Natasha, you make a really good point with the fraud is fraud thing, right? That when people counterfeit money, it's not the printing press's fault, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Fraud is fraud. Let's see. So, Louis, additional thoughts on this, the Biden administration order and such?
Well, it doesn't really resolve the quintessential question, which I'm going to set up for us here, and that's as follows: every business, I don't care what it's in, can be improved by artificial intelligence, and there are a lot of big brains out there building these large language models, and they can be built. They rely on heavy compute power, some significant GPUs. So, provided you've got some minimal capital to buy the compute power and the engineers to build the artificial intelligence large language model processing, you then need to get flows of data. And assuming that you can get some flows of data into this engine that's going to then produce outputs, the question then becomes who owns the outputs and who's owed a fee. Um, and I don't care what business you're in. This is really the question. Did you violate somebody's copyright? And the New York Times has put that question against OpenAI and Microsoft. And until we have an answer to that question, I'm not sure how these businesses are going to monetize.
Yeah.
And that's really the big question.
And one of our listeners writes in with this exact question. He says, "What are the implications of the New York Times versus OpenAI future content, IP ownership, etc.?" That is a big question for sure.
And the question is this fair use? Because there is an exception to the copyright infringement laws, which say that if the use of the material that's been published and copyrighted is fair, then a fee isn't owed.
Right.
And then if a fee is owed, how much of a fee is going to be owed? And how does that impact the commercial and monetization model of the business that you're building? So I continue to believe that it's really important to be smart on how you build and to buy data or to bring in data into your model that's very, very proprietary, that nobody else could ever have access to. And the faster you do that, the bigger the moat you're going to have around this business that you've created. And that is the arms race that we're in right now.
Right,
I
but
think
it's also true. There are a lot of startup founders and investors right now who are creating, new companies and new
Mhm.
applications
Mhm.
that are. And the idea is that the kind of the underlying intelligence will be driven by one of these big existing engines, right? Which is basically OpenAI or Bard or one of these. And so, if I do that, and then, you know, my app is kind of a secondary outlet that is spewing out stuff that it turns out belong to the New York Times, then, do I have liability for that?
Potentially.
Potentially.
potentially do. And that's why I think a lot of the clients that we're dealing with want to understand what is the AI implication of all of these third-party, technology software we're using, and how does it implicate us, right, in our doings and usings of those technologies.
Right.
Just to touch on the New York Times, OpenAI said something kind of interesting. They said that, at some point in time, you are going to have to use copyrighted material in order to teach these models, right? You're going to hit a point in time when, you're not going to be able not to use that. So I do think it will have an impact. It's very interesting because somebody had compared it to the Getty case. And they were like, what's the difference between New York Times and Getty?
Right.
And I think the New York Times was that it was almost verbatim, the articles that were spit out, right? So I think it'll be interesting to see how how it plays out, or it might even get settled outside of court. Who knows, right? Who knows what'll happen, but it'll be interesting case to see.
So the Getty case, for those who don't know, it's a different case between Getty Images, which is one of the largest licensed libraries of images in the world, and a generative AI image generation engine. I forget the name of the company now. So it's an engine where you say, make me a cat playing with a tennis ball, right? And it'll draw this for you. Well, it turns out that without Getty Images even knowing, these guys had their bots crawl the entire Getty Images library so that they could learn what cats look like, what tennis balls look like, what all this look like. So super interesting case. And has that been resolved, Natasha?
I don't think it has been.
Yeah.
No.
So, let's talk a little bit about I know you guys are U.S. attorneys, but the EU is pretty busy around this stuff as well. As a matter of fact, the EU tends to be out in front of the U.S. in terms of regulatory stuff often. And of course, for pretty much any startup today, you need to be compliant not only with U.S. regulations, but you have to be compliant with EU regulations because you're probably going to have users in the EU, right? So, any thoughts or insights into that?
Well, they obviously the EU is further along, right? They have an actual
Right.
AI Act coming out. I think it's in May is
Right.
when they're thinking of having it released. The model in the EU is interesting, and I'm wondering if, obviously in the executive order, Biden said, we're going to be the leaders, but we're also going to look what people have done around us. And so the EU did an interesting thing where they split between what they consider critical versus non-critical, right? And what you should regulate that's critical versus what you should regulate not so heavily because it's not critical. So in terms of, I don't know, like financials or discrimination, those are things that they think are critical and should be more heavily regulated. And the parallel between what the Biden administration did was recently they had requested that a few agencies, like kind of the higher, like, transportation, you're talking about health and human services, ask them to actually look at how AI can be regulated in those critical systems. So it's kind of alluding to the fact that if you are in kind of a high profile, defense, we're worried about AI in defense and who's using it and how they're using it, that's something that should be highly regulated. So that was an interesting kind of like parallel between the two kind of regulations of AI. And maybe the US is looking at the EU, and because obviously they're further along, to see maybe these are some things that we should be looking at.
Right. And then Louis quickly pointed out my geographic centric brain, which is that I mentioned the EU, but of course there's a whole bunch of other jurisdictions out there, including Asia.
Biggest one is China.
And
that
Latin
really
America.
the biggest one being China, as there's so much development going on over there, and so much need for our products to access that market. and I couldn't stress enough how important it is to comply with those regulations.
Right. Right. And then Erdogan wants to know whether AI is going to make the two of you unemployed.
I have spoken on this many times.
Take it away, Natasha.
We are further away from Terminator. I might be aging myself, this is not a Terminator age yet. I think what will happen is, like all technologies, it'll make us more efficient. We'll figure out different ways to do our jobs in a more efficient manner, right? We will have different jobs, right? But it will not make us extinct. And I know people counter that and say, no, eventually it'll take over. You won't be required. You won't be relevant. But I think until we can get to a point where people can 100% rely on the outputs, right? There's still hallucinations. There's still issues with AI. It's not a repeat and forget and walk away. I do think there's still relevance behind attorneys reviewing, making sure that the outputs are actually correct. Doing our jobs, essentially. There'll be more emphasis probably on training associates to figure out how can you assess if something is wrong or right. And no longer is it going to be, go learn on your own because you're going to go do all this research, right? They're just going to put in inputs and it'll pop it out. And they're going to have somebody to sit down and say, this is why it's wrong or this is why it's right. I think that we'll have to get better in terms of being prompt engineers, because that has a huge impact in terms of your output, right? Garbage in, garbage out. If you don't know how to properly ask, whatever you're asking, you're going to get garbage out. So I do think it'll change the way we work, but I don't think it will make us obsolete anytime soon anyways.
Well, shout out to my daughter, Michaela, who works for a startup in San Francisco called Ironclad. And what their software does is one aspect of what the software does is it'll read a contract for you and kind of mark out the things that probably should be discussed. So that's kind of an example of what Natasha's talking about, of kind of offloading the easier stuff to the machines so that the professionals can focus on the the tougher stuff, the higher level stuff. And
I just want to jump in there for a second.
Please.
As there's so many things that lawyers could do if they had more time. And time is, of course, how we sell our product, if you will. And so there's a lot of things that clients would benefit from, but they don't feel like they could reasonably access, because in the word efficient, there's effective, and then there's the price. And so AI I'm finding is allowing me just to do more things instantly, which means that at a very minimal cost, which allows me then to provide more services and makes clients more and more dependent. So up to now, Brett, it's been a very much a growth business for lawyers, AI.
I'm sure it has. Yeah, I'm sure it has. Right.
And I would also say that most AI businesses can look at my business and tell me what they could do with it. There are just so many use cases.
Right.
It's exciting.
Yeah, most of my physician friends talk about the same thing. That kind of in their mind, AI, they'll be able to kind of offload the easier stuff to AI so that the physicians can focus on the harder stuff. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, Eric Topol wrote a great book on AI in medicine called Deep Knowledge. Highly recommend.
So John points out that regulation is always trying to catch up, right? Because industry and technology move a whole lot faster than the regulators do. And so John says it's a losing game, other than the requirement to state at the beginning of any output that that this has been created by AI, which I think is a good point. And Ewa says, you'll be happy to know that Ewa says generative AI will not replace lawyers. And there's a case, you familiar with this case that she's referencing here, you guys? Meta versus Renza? No? Okay. Shows the importance of human oversight, right?
To touch on the outpacing, I think the one thing that I think will be interesting is the states have outpaced the feds in terms of just getting bills, getting legislation out and in place. So my question and query is, how are they going to reconcile, right? What will the feds do in connection with what states have already done, because they've moved a lot faster. So I think that'll be an interesting thing to see how the two will reconcile.
Will they though, Natasha?
I don't know. They could do many things, right? Some people had suggested maybe have a committee, where I don't know. We'll see. Right now, I think they are not putting too many stakes in the ground.
And then Bill kind of points out, he says, what is the Times complaining about? These AI models read their data, which is available on the internet, and spits out a response to the question without citing its source. And I do think that's kind of the heart of it at the moment, right? Is that at least when I use Google, the source is cited, right? Whereas with ChatGPT, it gives me an answer, which is generated from a whole bunch of stuff the bots have read, but it doesn't cite any of its sources.
No, it doesn't cite in its sources. And I think the pain for the New York Times, like I said before, was that these articles were verbatim. Maybe a few words changed, but pretty much just spitting out exactly what the journalist had already written.
Right.
Without, like you said, giving credit.
Yeah, I posted to LinkedIn the other day about how it's interesting that we're at an age now where plagiarism is easier than ever before, right?
Yeah.
But also catching plagiarism is easier than ever before, right? Because, it's pretty easy for software to go out and find verbatim snippets that have been copied from somewhere, right? Interesting times. Okay, so Natasha, so if I'm thinking about creating a new startup today that is going to be kind of in the AI space, so in other words, either I'm going to create a new an LLM of my own and such, or I'm going to be a vertical solution of some sort that harnesses some of the existing LLMs. Either way, what should I think about with regard to regulatory environment that I want to operate safely within?
Yeah, I would say, where are you sourcing your inputs? Right, making sure that wherever you're sourcing your inputs are accurate. Depends on what vertical, obviously, you're in, but that'll make a big difference in terms of whether you have bias, whether you have issues with the outputs. The second thing would be, again, I touched on this whole theme around explainability. So the government is pretty much pushing on, you have to understand what's happening in the black box. No longer are there things where you can say, well, I don't know, I just put it in and this came out and we're great. So understanding and trying to explain what is actually happening behind the curtain. And then again, touching on this whole red team, where you have a team, dedicated individuals that look at the outputs to see if there are any issues that should be highlighted or brought to the attention of the rest of the organization. So those are the things I think we should look at. But really, what is the source of the information you're putting in?
Right. And if I am using a third-party engine, I assume that I probably want to carefully examine the contract with that provider.
Absolutely. Always, anything dealing with AI, any contract, you're talking to a lawyer, review it. I even read the little terms and conditions when people laugh at me when it's so small, but still.
That's your job.
So make sure you read the contracts, right? There are more provisions being put in place specifically relating to AI, so that is good, right? No longer relying on old contract forms to try to assume that they're covering and protecting. But make sure you're reviewing those, or have your attorney review it to make sure and understand where your liability is.
Right. Louis, anything you'd add to that in terms of things that a startup founder should think about today?
Yeah, I think we're in a period for the next 2 or 3 years where I think we're in a regulatory sandbox where there aren't that many regulations that the government is going to put in place. But I think when the technology matures and there are more commercial aspects, then it'll be important to be designing in compliance from the get-go. I think privacy is very important, and protecting personal information. That's something you can do now, and making sure you design that in. But I think the next 2-3 years will be continue to be the Wild West.
And some of the states are actually using, to what you were saying, Louis, privacy as a means to regulate AI. So they're not coming out with a specific, this is my act on AI, but they're actually using privacy legislation to help regulate some of those. So agreed, keep an eye out for what's going on with privacy.
So Marcello asks, when AI is used to automate operations and decision-making in supply chains, for example, who will be liable for that decision-making if things go wrong? So if AI gives you bad advice, can you sue the AI?
No.
I think the reason we're laughing is we're like, I don't know.
Yeah. But I think it's similar to what you said, right? Yeah, I think you just have to be aware of the outputs. You no longer can you say, well, I didn't know how it happened, because there will be someone liable.
Mm-hmm. So, Louis, you mentioned that you see all kinds of opportunities out there. You got any investment advice?
I do not give investment advice, and that is why I am still an hourly wage worker. If you're taking investment advice from a lawyer, you're in big trouble.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Those are wise words. So we have another question here about images, and in this case, it's specifically about the film industry. They said, in my specific line of work, we generate live rendered backgrounds for film production. What legislation are we likely to see that might affect the use of AI generated digital assets, whether they're 2D or 3D?
No idea. Natasha?
No, not specifically in the film production. Maybe, well, you might be looking at maybe deep fake. I think I would.
Yeah. I think, unfortunately, I mean, by this panel who's a film and entertainment industry expert, but I would assume the answer is probably the same in terms of any IP where there's some risk that somebody is going to say you're monetizing IP that belongs to me. In the same way that if you made a film background, if you stole somebody's photo and used it as a film background, that would be a problem, right?
And some of the things are requiring that you indicate on whatever renderings you've taken from somewhere else to say that this was generated by AI, or this was not, something that was originally produced. So right. That would be something. But again, the regulations are kind of all over the map. I think that's
right.
Why we're grappling.
So that would be, so Natasha, that would just be like in the credits at the end of the film. It would say, the background you saw in these 3 scenes was generated by AI, and that
or maybe
would be required that you disclose that.
Yeah, some of the regulations are asking for that. Now, in practice, is it when the AI generated, item comes up, you have to have a notation, or at the end? I guess it depends on how much is generated by AI, right? We have seen entire films that people have tried to generate using AI. So,
right. And Erdogan has another provocative question, which is that can AI be listed as a co-inventor on a patent?
We should ask our patent folks, but I know that there is a way to patent certain AI tech, and that is outside of my scope of practice. But yeah, I've spoken to some of our patent attorneys, and they've figured out a way.
Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts you guys have before we wrap this up? I think as Louis said, it's just going to kind of be the wild west for the next year or two, because technology is way ahead of the regulators at the moment. But any other specific advice that you would give startup founders and investors?
I would say what we are doing at Foley is putting together what we're calling a heat map, so that you can hover over a particular state to see what status is of particular AI regulations. So I think for now, because there are so many moving parts and the states are moving at different paces, that will help to kind of keep people level set, especially if you're a cross-country organization.
Right. Louis?
Brett, the name of the game right now is, can you raise enough money to get your business to product market fit? And product market fit is a bar that has been rising significantly over the last 2 years, even for AI companies. Yeah. And I think $1 million or $2 million of contracted annual recurring revenue might be evidence that you have something. It is not evidence of product market fit. A venture firm that's going to give you a real check is going to require you to get to somewhere in the neighborhood of 10.
Mhm.
And so we're seeing a real large group of companies that have gotten to the 1, but not to the 10.
Mhm.
Right.
And so really it's a race to get to the 10 as efficiently as you can, because you've got limited funds. And that's really the name of the game on January 31, 2024, the date of this recording.
Wise words, Louis. So we're just about out of time. It's a super interesting, area. It's I've been in Silicon Valley for a long time, and so I've seen all kinds of, of waves of the next big thing that everybody was all in on, and then, a few months later, that's old news, and everybody's all in on something new. But I do think that in my time in Silicon Valley, I have never seen anything that so clearly really is going to change everything as generative AI is.
Yeah. No, I agree completely.
So it's an area for us all to keep close tabs on. Now, do you guys have any resources? I think Foley does have some
Yeah,
sort of a booklet or something on privacy regulations, and there's some
so
relevant stuff in there about AI.
so we have an ebook on AI. We also have on our website a whole page dedicated to AI. And as I said before, it pretty much has most of, it has all of the regulations that are coming out in kind of a summary and blog form in terms of the key points. Also, there's information in terms of other intersections, right? Not just AI, but how AI intersects with manufacturing, how it in fact intersects with healthcare. Because again, it's one of those areas where it's not just one vertical, it's across all areas. So I would urge people to definitely look at our website under the innovative tech sector. There's an AI subsector.
The innovative tech sector on Foley.com.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And we're gonna let Ewa have the last question here, which is that should startups disclose AI and AI generated data on their products? Put a disclaimer in the fine print, their contracts, etc.
I would say that depending on who your customers are, they're probably already asking for that. But it is a good thing to review, have somebody review your contracts to assess what you are doing. And I think the future is there will have to be some type of disclosure.
Yeah. And I think from my perspective, generally disclosure has, kind of all upside and not much downside.
Agreed.
So yeah, just go ahead and disclose it, because there's not much downside, and and there may be some significant upside depending on how the regulations play out.
Exactly.
All right. Thanks very much, you two. And thanks to our audience for joining yet another Wednesday morning discussion on issues related to entrepreneurs, innovation, and investors. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.